Todd Starnes. Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, proudly on AFR Talk. Hope you all are having a wonderful hump day. On the flip side of this segment, we will be taking your calls on cruise control, Ted Cruz, and how he handled, how the senator handled a heckler. We'll get to that. But right now, we are joined by our good friend, Dr. Mark Calabria, Director, thank you. Was it under construction there? Director of Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. And, well, Doctor, welcome back. I was listening to the press conference Monday, and the president was going to meet with regulators regarding Dodd-Frank. Now, Dodd-Frank's implementation, 60%, unlike 50+%, like 50+% of the deadlines, rulemaking deadlines in the case of Dodd-Frank have not been met. So he was asked, Josh Earnest, Deputy Press Secretary, was asked what the president would be conveying, what message he would be conveying to these regulators. And here is what Josh Earnest had to say. Roll it.
He's going to convey to them the sense of urgency that he feels about getting these regulations under Wall Street reform implemented promptly, and most importantly, implemented in a way that protects the long-term stability of our financial system and the financial interests of middle-class families all across the country. A recent good example of this was the confirmation of Richard Cordray as the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. For the first time, consumers in America will have a watchdog in Washington, D.C. that will be looking out for their interests. There's no question that large financial institutions, including investment firms and banks on Wall Street, wield significant influence over the political process in Washington, D.C. That's the benefit of having independent regulators who can make their own determinations about the rules and regulations that should be put in place, again, to protect the financial system, but also to protect the interests of middle-class families.
Wanting to get in the middle class or being in the middle class, however one wants to put themselves, I don't like a cork on my fork from the federal government. That said, he mentioned protection, influence, cronyism, in essence, gaming the system, and the independence of the regulators to interpret the rules. You have been talking about Dodd-Frank and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Chief Richard Cordray, and a lot of people would say, and the lady out here, we'd say, well, this isn't really a big deal. We hear a lot about it. You've said it's a very big deal. Is it still a big deal?
It's an extremely big deal. This is a very powerful agency. And, of course, I'll set aside this sort of irony of the president calling, quote unquote, independent regulators into his office and telling them what to do. I thought they were independent. So doesn't that mean they don't take dictation from the president? I guess what he really meant is they should be independent of people he doesn't like, but dependent on him. But setting all that aside, it really is a question of, are these agencies looking to protect you or not? And, of course, let's also mention the Federal Trade Commission has been around since the 30s and certainly has been tasked with going after unfair and deceptive practices in the financial markets and in other markets. So, this notion that we had no consumer financial protection before the crisis, is simply false. But part of the problem is that, there really is this attitude of you can't make decisions for yourself, that, businesses exist not to actually have mutually beneficial exchange with you in which they serve consumers, but they exist to rip you off. And that's completely, the perspective here. But what we really need is a system where, if you put out a poor product and you rip people off, if the competitive process drives you out of business, in the real tension here, the thing that I always have the biggest problem with is, the evidence is pretty clear that the best friend for the consumer is competition and choice. And yet this agency comes in and wants to set up all sorts of barriers to entry, wants to make it difficult for new businesses. They want to start all these regulatory costs, which, of course, are very hard for small businesses to bear. And so, I think one of the outcomes of this agency is going to be less competition, less choice. And again, I think that's going to hurt the consumer at the end of the day. Now, of course, there are a lot of sort of theories underlying this. So-called behavioral economics is really a big driver of this new agency. They've really got this interesting sort of insight from their perspective that the government needs to come in not just to protect you from businesses, but the government needs to come in and protect you from your future self, that you in the future will regret decisions you make today, and it's the role of the government to stop you from hurting yourself.
How specifically are they doing that? How specifically are they protecting us from our future selves? I'm just envisioning a future Crane, and I'm sure I scared the audience and my wife, for that matter. But go ahead.
Well, and let me be clear. Obviously, we all make mistakes. Nobody's perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not perfect. The government isn't perfect. And we certainly all make mistakes we wish we could take back on occasion. But the question is really, who's going to be the better judge of those mistakes? You trying to learn in the marketplace, you trying to learn what the right decisions are. Our government come in and saying, well, even if you want to do this, we know this is going to be bad for you. It's like Mayor Bloomberg and the Big Gulp. Well, you really want to drink that Big Gulp, or we're going to stop you. And you're really seeing this agency go after types of lending. For instance, a lot of the fringe players, things like check cashers and payday lenders. I think we all hope we never find ourselves in a situation where we have to use fringe finance. But the fact is that we're better off doing that. You're far better off going to a payday lender than you are going to a loan shark. So, you're going to be pushed into illegal options, higher cost options. And there really is an attitude of this agency, in my opinion, where they let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And so, the fact is, I think in life there's a lot of choices that aren't necessarily great, but it's better to have those choices than have no choices at all.
And when you talk about the payday lender, great really does, it's emblematic of the greater issue of what they are doing, and the perfect versus the good, the idea that they're going to protect us from ourselves. What it does is it also creates an environment for the people that are making the rules, government. The people that can play are not the small business owners. They are the big businesses, and it costs the opportunity for small businesses to grow and to develop.
And, it also opens the door for insiders. I mean, one of the things we've already seen with the consumer agency, they've put out some proposed rules on what types of mortgages will be, quote-unquote, qualified mortgage. And if it's not a qualified mortgage, it's going to have a credible amount of litigation risk, and most lenders are going to stay away from that. But what you've had is a group of senior staff at the CFPB leave, start a consultancy where they're going to offer mortgages because they help write the rules. And so they know where the line is, even though the line is blurry and subjective. And they're going to be ones to get rich basically riding that line and trying to figure out what side of that line is it on. So you really just inject this complexity into the system where the insiders benefit at the expense of the rest of us. And again, the system's going to work that way. And there's a lot of pressure essentially to try to make, as I've said before in the show, to make the prudent borrowers subsidize the imprudent. There really is a pushback, against actually risk-based pricing where higher risk borrowers, pay more than lower risk borrowers, which I think is legitimate.
And it's interesting to me that we always that there are a couple themes. One is accountability, and the free market provides accountability because you face the consequence of your action, be it the lender, be it the lendee. The other part to that is what you've been talking about, which all parties rail against and ostensibly are against, the R's, the D's, even the I's, is against lobbying. But the only way that lobbying's effective is if the federal government takes that power. And what we really need to see is the government to cut back on its power and go back within its original constitutional parameters. Is that the true answer?
That is absolutely the case. If you do not want people coming to Washington to buy favors, then the solution is to stop having Washington sell favors. Mm-hmm. It's really not complicated. When you what is it? I think Mark Twain or maybe it's P.J. O'Rourke who said that when legislation is for sale, the first thing that gets sold are the legislators. I think we need to go back to the rule of law. We need to have checks and balances. I would be the first person to express frustration and criticism of Congress, but to think that the CFPB is better off not having the regular budgetary process. I ask my friends who defend the CFPB, do they think the Pentagon would be better outside of the appropriations process?
Explain that real quick, like out of the budgetary process. Explain that in layman's terms, what's going on there.
The Constitution sets up a mechanism where Congress is supposed to come up with a budget. Congress is supposed to decide where the money comes from, where the money is spent, and to some extent, it's supposed to be a big, picture of how we would all do our household budgets. It's supposed to match. And so Dodd-Frank set up a system where the consumer agency is not funded by the appropriations process. Congress does not set its budget. it sets its own budget, and the Federal Reserve has to give it money. So there's no budgetary constraints. There's no question on the budget. The Federal Reserve can't reject the budget request. And so it really removes this important check and balance. And again, the brilliance, in my opinion, probably the core brilliance of our Constitution that our founding fathers, looked at. And again, our founding fathers have all sorts of flaws. There are flaws in our Constitution, but the core brilliance of it is this checks and balance of setting power and interest against power and interest. And one of the ways they did this was to have these checks on the funding of agencies. And so Dodd-Frank takes the CFPB completely out of the funding process. I think it's a horrible precedent. If you can fund this by printing money at the Fed, what's next? Are we going to, fund peanut subsidies out of the, are we going to fund wars out of the Federal Reserve? It really starts to me a very dangerous precedent where you're really moving all budgetary accountability. I like to believe we send our members of Congress to Washington to be responsible, and that part of that responsibility is figuring out making the books to balance. And when they take an agency off the books, it is a dereliction of duty.
Well said. And human nature does not evolve. And so that's why they're always going with the perfect and believing they always have the answers. We're just as fallen as we've ever been.
We're the only ones with biases, apparently.
Hey, Mark, great to be with you. Thank you for taking this
Pleasure.
time. Take care. Dr. Mark Calabria, Director of Regulation Studies at the Cato Institute. Some insight into the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Forks on forks, it's going to happen, and it's for our own good. Brain Durham's Nothing But Truth. Your call's next on heckling. Would you heckle? Brain Durham's Nothing But Truth. AFR Talk.